Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for this week's video lecture. Today we're looking at Strayer's Chapter 8, China and the World, East Asian Connections. And when we talk about the reemergence of a unified China in the post-classical period, after the fall of the Han Dynasty, China enters a period of several hundred years where there are several competing kingdoms. It's not a time of total chaos like the Warring States period was, but in the titles of these times, the six dynasties or the three kingdoms, suggesting a sort of fragmentation that once reunified and once the dynastic cycle is put back in place, this becomes a golden age of Chinese achievement. It starts with the Sui dynasty, who had many achievements such as the dramatic expansion of the canal system, but it proved to be a short-lived dynasty as their emperors were harsh and warlike, but they did reestablish the mandate of heaven. The Tang and the Song built upon the achievements of the Sui and established a state system that would last over 1,000 years. The Tang and Song were noteworthy for their political achievements, but also for their cultural vibrancy and economic dynamism. These dynasties formalized and expanded the Confucian-based exam system. In theory, they cracked down on cheating, and the exams were open to all regardless of class. However, there were irregularities, and the wealthy elite had an economic advantage in that they could pay for schooling and tutors. Nonetheless, schools and colleges grew in number, and the system that trained the efficient bureaucracy that governed China was an apparent success. Thanks to investments in infrastructure such as the canal system, which allowed the cheap transportation of rice and wheat over long distances, there was a major economic boom in this period. In addition to staple crops, Chinese farmers could produce specialized crops for specific markets. More food meant more people, and China more than doubled its population in this period. Cities saw tremendous growth in the development of increasingly productive and sophisticated industries. The boom did have clear environmental consequences, with much of China's old-growth forest being cut down for fuel. The great city of Chang'an, or Xi'an, remained the capital of the Sui, Tang, and early Song. It also served as a model for capital cities in Korea and Japan. However, with the success of the Grand Canal, the economic focus of China moved to the port city of Hangzhou. With a population of over 1 million, this was the world's largest city, and it enjoyed a vibrant cultural life with a lively entertainment industry and growing print culture. When the Jurchen occupied the northern part of China to form the Jin dynasty, the Song moved the capital to Hangzhou, thus starting the period known as the Southern Song. In this map, you can see, first in the bottom right corner, the large extent of the Tang dynasty extending way out into the northern part of South Asia. And in the larger map, you can see the Southern Song, so-called because they had moved the capital from Chang'an to Hangzhou. But if you notice a couple things about this, first of all, they kept expanding the Great Wall, but it obviously didn't do a whole lot of good as the Jurchen moved into northern China to form the Jin dynasty. Note as well, the blue area is the Grand Canal system. The key feature here is it connects the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, to Hangzhou, which is this great port. It's a well-protected port that allows access to the Indian Ocean. Okay, women in the Song dynasty, though, this represents a change, rather dramatic change. While elite women enjoyed various freedoms in the Tang dynasty due to its cultural influences from the nomadic peoples, the Song era saw a renewed patriarchy based on a very conservative reading of Confucius. Consequently, restrictions on women increased, especially the elite women, but in fact across all levels of society. In the Song, men were to be scholars and administrators, and women were viewed as weak and distracting. This attitude became embodied in the new practice of foot binding, which grew in popularity under the Song. While associated with the construction of frail beauty, the practice also restricted the freedom of women to move, quite literally. Traditionally, women had been involved in making textiles or cloth. With the commercialization of weaving, though, many were pushed out of the textile labor force. However, some women found new jobs in other professions, such as domestic service, retail, and entertainment, including work as concubines. Women did see an increase in their property rights, as well as new access to education. So one of the things that doesn't change, though, is the fact that the Chinese are constantly in contact with the nomads to the north from Central Asia. And this leads us to a discussion of the tribute system, which I hope you do remember something of from previous eras. But in China, it takes on a particular style in this period. First of all, China viewed itself as the Middle Kingdom. It was literally the center of the world. And it was the height of civilization, radiating civilization and culture outwards from this center in their own minds. Inferior barbarians were then expected to recognize Chinese superiority. For China, the tribute system was a way to manage inferior barbarians on the periphery of civilization. It was supposed to allow a way to control them without having to engage them militarily. Foreigners were expected to send tribute missions of ceremonial gifts to the capital and perform the kowtow. The kowtow is a series of bows to the ground where the person who is giving these gifts has to lay flat on the ground and perform this very elaborate ritual to show his recognition of China's superiority. In return, the missions would get various gifts of great value and the prestige of being allied with China. The tribute system looked a little different in practice. First of all, the reality of the tribute system for these groups was essentially that the Chinese were paying them as protection to keep them from raiding. Large gifts of wine, silk, and grain kept the nomads from having to steal it from the Chinese and allowed the Chinese court to maintain the fiction of its invulnerability. In reality, though, China was very vulnerable to raids from the warlike horsemen of the steppes. At times, they not only raided, but also conquered parts of China, particularly in times of weakness. Two particular groups of nomads from Central Asia, the Khitan and later the Jurchen or Jin, seized parts of northern China after the fall of the Tang and would force the Song to give them silver, silk, and tea in addition to having them move the capital. Culturally, though, there's also some exchange going on. The first is that there's not much culture moving into Central Asia. While some aspects of Chinese culture made their way north, Chinese-style agriculture and material life was virtually impossible in the steppes and grasslands of Central Asia. Thus, there was little way to replicate being Chinese among the Turkic nomads of Central Asia. In contrast, the indigenous people of southern China were almost completely absorbed into the great Chinese cultural world, and many of the nomads from the north, once taking territory in China itself, slowly began assimilating into Chinese culture. As both the Tang and Song dynasties had their origins in leaders of mixed Chinese and Turkic families, there was a great influence on the court culture. Turkic battle techniques were also used by Chinese generals in the field. For some time in the Tang dynasty, there was a fad for things from the West, Central Asia, Persia, India, and Arabia. Music, fashion, dancing, and other aspects of culture were popular among the northern Chinese elites. The southern Chinese, however, saw themselves as the heirs to the Han, the original great dynasty. They were extremely critical of the fad for things foreign, and this will become a constant tension throughout later periods of Chinese history. So, China is reunited. It's sort of trying to find a way to manage its barbarian neighbors to the north, but it's also expanding out into neighbors in the east and south. The first of these is Korea, which of course is geographically connected to China. And had a period of a bunch of warring kingdoms itself with no clear winner until the Silla, with the aid of the Tang dynasty, were the first Korean state to unite the warlike leaders of the peninsula. While they did receive Tang aid, they fiercely guarded their independence. Their style of governance was replicated by later dynasties, the Koryo and the Yi. The new Korean state did agree to be a tribute state and sent many students to China to study the Confucian classics. Later, Confucian schools were developed in Korea. A very orthodox interpretation of Confucianism led to serious restrictions on Korean women. While there was a strong Sinitic influence on the Korean elite, Sinitic meaning Chinese, We'll talk about that in a moment. Little of this made its way down to the poor Korean peasants living in serf-like conditions. The elite also maintained their language and culture, even developing an alphabet called Hangul rather than using Chinese characters. In this map of Korea, you can see the different kingdoms that are struggling against each other before the Silla eventually align themselves with the Tang dynasty and so unite all of the Korean peninsula under their rule. Okay, so another example can be found in Vietnam, which is of course also connected to China to the south. The Han conquered the Vietnamese heartland around the Red River and ruled it as a part of China for nearly 1,000 years. Many Chinese migrated south, bringing Confucianism culture and administrative systems. This prolonged contact thoroughly sinicized the elite. Now, this root word sino, you'll see it all over the place. Sinification or sinicization or sinicized or Sino-Tibetan or Sino-Turkic. It's a root word that comes from Latin, and it's really an odd use because, of course, the Romans knew there was something out there, but they didn't know they were actually Chinese. So that word is kind of inappropriate, and it's used exclusively in the West. It's generally not a term that's used among scholars throughout the rest of the world. Nonetheless, it's used in our text, and it's one that you need to know. So, the Vietnamese elite lived as part of a greater Chinese world and were a culturally distinct entity separate from the lower classes who tended to keep many of their indigenous traditions. While independence was won from a fierce rebellion, the new Vietnamese state became a tribute state of China and used Chinese systems and symbols in its statecraft. So even as it got its independence from China after the fall of the Han and through periods of weakness, it still maintains a kind of Chinese style as a tribute state to China. While the elite were very much in the Chinese cultural world, the lower classes were part of a greater Southeast Asian world. Some of the things that they did were very different from their elite, more Chinese acting people. They enjoyed cockfighting, eating the betel nut, and greater freedoms for women, among other things. In this map of Vietnam, you can see that the area that splits off from China, which is up here, growing further to the south. Here's the Red River. This was the area that had been Chinese for nearly 1,000 years before it's eventually split off. Okay, the third example is Japan, and Japan obviously is an island nation. So because of its physical distance from China, it was never actually conquered by any Chinese. This allowed the Japanese to voluntarily and selectively borrow what they wanted from China without having anything forced on them. A prominent aristocrat led a movement to study the Chinese political system and use it as a model for a new Japanese state. He launched several large missions where students, monks, scholars, and artists visited China to learn what they could and bring it back to Japan. However, the Japanese never created a fully centralized Chinese-style state system. As the emperor of Japan was often more ceremonial than not, the real power fell into the hands of the regional warlords, creating a unique type of feudalism we will examine more closely in class. While Buddhism was a Chinese import, it did not completely replace the indigenous animist belief system we know as Shinto, in which kami, or local spirits, were venerated. Indeed, many Japanese blended a kind of Buddhism called Zen, which we'll talk about in a moment, with Shinto spirit worship. Compared to Korean women, Japanese elite women enjoyed much more freedom. Property rights and divorce regulations were much more favorable. This may be because the Japanese studied China during the more liberal Tang dynasty. There were many great works of literature written by elite Japanese women. And this map of China, there's a couple of cities I want you to take note of. Nara and Kyoto, or Heian it was called at one point, are two capitals at various times. There's a city over here, Kamakura, which becomes the central area of a shogunate which is something we're going to get into in class. There's a whole lot more going on in Japan than what Strayer talks about, and indeed we'll spend a couple of days in class looking exclusively at Japan. So, in addition to its influence in East Asia and its contact with its neighbors to the north in Central Asia, it's also got contact with a much larger area of the world. And Strayer uses the term spillovers to denote China's impact on Eurasia. In other words, how things leaving China affect the rest of the world. China's dynamic economy and technological innovations spread far past its borders and were adopted into the Islamic world and Europe. Paper was a huge innovation and spread throughout the Islamic world very quickly. While Muslim cultures valued calligraphy and did not take to printing, Europeans would develop printing where they began to use paper. Paper and printing allowed for the spread of literacy in Europe, stimulating important changes in the coming centuries. Other technologies were modified and expanded upon. Gunpowder, for example, was refined as a key component of warfare by Muslim armies that made cannons and Europeans who would develop personal firearms. Sailors around the world tinkered with the technology of the compass, adapting it to their specific needs. The vibrant Chinese economy produced finished goods such as textiles and porcelains for export to distant markets. In return, Chinese began to consume commodities such as spices from the islands of Southeast Asia. This process served to build mutually dependent markets of consumers and producers. But at the same time, China is bringing stuff into their economy. China's contact with the outside world also allowed technology, ideas, and crops to flow into China. From India, the Chinese learned how to raise cotton and sugarcane. These became important sectors of the Chinese agricultural sector. From Vietnam, China gained a faster-growing rice that did well in the southern Yangtze Basin. This led to a major growth in population and a shift of China's demographic balance from the north to the south. From Persia, China learned of windmills and developed a similar technology. The spread of the Buddhist world in China led to the development of printed images and texts, as devout Buddhists wanted images of the Buddha and short religious texts that could be carried as charms. In the Tang dynasty, Buddhist monasteries transformed the practice of printing with seals into printing with blocks. The first printed book was the Buddhist classic, the Diamond Sutra. A Buddhist monk from India first identified the soils that contained saltpeter and were flammable. That would eventually lead to the formulation for gunpowder. Thanks to the connections with the Indian Ocean basins, the cities of coastal China soon saw the development of communities including people from Southeast Asia, India, Persia, Arabia, and beyond. Quanzhou had a Buddhist, Muslim, and Hindu place of worship and study, for example. While violence could erupt between ethnic communities, as in the massacre of tens of thousands of foreigners in the 870s, trade with the Indian Ocean world created major economic growth in South China. Merchants increasingly gained new social acceptance and started to overcome the older Confucian disdain. Probably as a result of this contact with the outside world, though, the biggest cultural impact has to be Buddhism. But when it comes into China, it's initially got some problems. The first of these is that when Buddhism first came to China via the Silk Roads during the Han Dynasty, it was perceived as too foreign and too un-Chinese to become popular. The emphasis on individual salvation and withdrawal into monasteries conflicted with the Confucian emphasis on the family and social obligations to be engaged in making the world a more harmonious place. Buddhist discussions of infinite time fell on deaf ears to a culture that measures time by generations and dynasties. Once the Han Dynasty began to crumble and then collapse, Buddhism quickly made inroads into Chinese society as Confucianism was discredited and the world became an unstable and dangerous place. While Buddhist teachings gave meaning to a world in chaos and explained suffering as a part of life, monks provided shelter for travelers and refugees. Soon Chinese from all levels of society turned to the Buddhist message, and elite Chinese began to sponsor monasteries and other institutions. Buddhist monks also made a concerted effort to translate the terms and concepts of the faith into a meaningful and acceptable message for Chinese society. For example, there was a greater emphasis on patriarchy in the Chinese translations of the scriptures to make it more palatable for the Chinese audience. With its emphasis on relics, rituals, and deities, the Mahayana branch of the faith spread into China. A popular form of Buddhism was called the Pure Land School, which taught that simply repeating the name of an earlier Buddha, Amitabha, would lead to rebirth in a land of paradise. Later, another form of Buddhism developed called Chan in China and then Zen in Japan that required intensive study and meditation. This did not get the popularity in China that Pure Land Buddhism did, but it was the variety that would eventually spread briefly into Korea and then into Japan. Under the Sui dynasty, Emperor Wendi built monasteries at China's 5 sacred mountains and used it as a rationale for his reign and military campaigns. With state support, monasteries became important commercial enterprises and amassed great wealth. The state supervised the exam system for entry into monkhood and kept other forms of state control over the Buddhist institutions. So, Buddhism becoming more Chinese and on the rise. However, if you look at this map, here's the heartland of Buddhism in India, and of course it will spread. These areas will later pretty much get rid of all Buddhism. The key, though, is you can see once it gets sort of plugged into the Silk Roads and also in the south, the Indian Ocean, that's when it's going to spread through China in various ways, eventually Korea and Japan, Vietnam as well. And remember, down here, there's Srivijaya, which is a Buddhist kingdom that is right in that area between the Indian Ocean and the China Sea, until it is conquered by until it becomes a sultanate, the Malacca Sultanate. Okay. Eventually, though, the Buddhism loses state support, and so there becomes a crisis in Chinese Buddhism. Many people resented Buddhism for a variety of reasons. The tax-exempt wealth that the monasteries amassed due to their commercial activities drew jealousy from many people, not the least the state, who saw lost revenues. Others did not like Buddhist ideas about withdrawing from society and celibacy as they conflicted with Confucian emphasis on the family. Others disliked the foreign origins and nature of the faith. A very bloody rebellion against the Tang dynasty was led by a general of foreign origin who at one point even captured the capital city of Chang'an. Eventually the rebellion was put down, but it did severely weaken the Tang dynasty and perhaps more importantly increased Chinese xenophobia or hatred of anything foreign, including Buddhism. A scholar named Han Yu launched a scathing counterattack on Buddhism, telling the emperor that the Buddha spoke a foreign language, not that of the Chinese people. Many scholars point to his counterattack as the beginnings of Neo-Confucianism, a belief system that used Buddhist and Taoist concepts to develop a newer, more strict version of Confucianism. A series of decrees ordered hundreds of thousands of monks and nuns to return to a normal tax-paying life. Temples and monasteries were destroyed or taken over by the state, and Buddhists could not use precious metals and gems in their artwork any longer. Despite the persecution, Buddhism had become a permanent fixture in Chinese culture. This is best expressed by a proverb that says that the sons of the Han wear a Confucian cap, a Taoist robe, and Buddhist sandals. Indeed, many Chinese people freely blended aspects from all three traditions in their daily lives. That's the heart of the chapter. It's the part of the outline that you've got. You'll notice in this presentation I left out the openings and reflections to try to scale back some of the time commitment. Hope you were able to get everything you need, and I'll look forward to seeing you in class.